Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 214, Footwear in the Canon. Well, hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And we are going to be tapping along in this episode today. Burt, have you got your dancing shoes on?
I do have my dancing shoes on, and the problem is every time I get them dry clean, they come back a little tight.
Oh, goodness gracious.
Yeah.
Goodness. But have you ever seen that picture of Fred Astaire sprawled out on a chair in his apartment with a huge pile of shoes in front of him? Black and white photo.
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's probably one of the most amazing photos of him because, I mean, look, Fred Astaire, the iconic Hollywood dancer, associated with shoes, he was actually. He seems like a pretty slight guy, a slight fellow, very thin and lithe. And you would think that a guy of his slim size would have small feet. He actually took a 10.5. Did you know that?
Well, my shoe size is 11, so I don't think that's
perfect.
Big.
Perfect. Well, I'll be over here in my 10s. A little taller than Fred Astaire, kind of tiptoeing my way through the tulips to the administrative section of the show, where we tell you this show is available. The show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles214. It'll take you to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com directly to this episode. You can find any links that we have in the episode, any additional material, and for members of our supporters, our PayPal and Patreon supporters in our Discord community, we will post additional material. Not only will you get the episode ahead of everyone else, but you will also have an opportunity to see any additional material. To do that, just go to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com and sign up to become a patron for as little as $1 a month. It helps us fund the show here to do the research, which includes purchasing materials and obviously hosting the email and the sound files and the website and all the rest. So we won't get into all those minutiae because we're here to get into the minutiae of Sherlock Holmes. So let's do it. Now, the inspiration for this episode, Bert, comes from a book from our friends at Wessex Press, who are sponsors over at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. But the book is called A Quick Succession of Subjects, Lectures and Speeches on Sherlock Holmes. And it's by our pal, Chris Redmond, who is a longtime member of the Baker Street Irregulars and the bootmakers of Toronto. And he actually gave a speech at the Sons of the Copper Beeches some time ago. I guess it was May 9th, 2003, about footwear in the canon. And I thought, what a great jumping off point for us to discuss that, because I don't think we've talked about shoes, boots, slippers, and other assorted footwear in the canon.
No, we haven't. And the lovely thing about the topic is that it's an opportunity for Sherlockismus. It's one of these opportunities that gives Holmes the ability to observe things about shoes, about their wearer, about their condition, and develop insights about what that particular person might have been doing. And they delight the reader. They astonish Watson and they move the stories along. So it's a lovely topic, and it's a great place to start taking a look at the particular talk, which I don't remember. I think I probably was at the 2003 meeting of the Sons of the Copper Beeches, but it's a great place to start with the one I always think of when I think about the subject of Sherlock Holmes and shoes, which is Sir Henry Baskerville.
Probably the most famous pair of footwear or non-pair of footwear, as it turned out, in the canon. What do we know about Sir Henry Baskerville? Of course, the bootmakers of Toronto are named for this set of footwear. What do we know about them?
Well, I find it really interesting that the color of the boots, that always surprised me. But what we know about him is that Sir Henry has newly arrived in England. He's now inherited the Baskerville estate, and he's come to London, and he's been met by Dr. Mortimer. And apparently the first thing he does is try to, it must have been clear to him that his ensemble, his clothing style, was different than what he observed the people on the streets of London and in England wearing. And so he clearly set out to make some purchases and correct that. And one of the things he bought was a pair of boots, but he bought a pair of tan boots. And, I always think, particularly if I had arrived in London in that time, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, I would think that in terms of the gents, I would be seeing gents wearing spats, obviously, some sort of foot covering for the soil in the street, but also primarily black boots or perhaps brown boots. But why I would choose tan? Because tan, is such of three colors of boot, a tan boot is, more difficult to keep clean and is more prone to picking up soil and so on. So I wondered, why did, of all the things he would buy, why would he say, I need a pair of tan boots?
Well, I think it's an indication as to Sir Henry's pedigree. He's come over from Canada, arrived in England ostensibly to take control of the family estate in Dartmoor, Baskerville Hall, and its environs. But prior to that, what do we know about Sir Henry? He was city folk, as it were. He was in Canada, and I believe, was there something to do with the Great Western Railway and Sir Henry at the time? Was he?
Oh, I don't remember. I thought he was a farmer or had.
Well, he seemed to me, if anything, he was kind of like a gentleman farmer, an estate manager, and to me, it seemed like he was affecting the role of a country squire rather than inhabiting it himself. An actual country squire would wear clothing of the country. And there was very different clothing between city and country in those times, and certainly through the early part of the 20th century. You've even watched some of those, say the old Jeeves and Woodhouse episodes with Fry and Laurie. They would affect Bertie would affect a very different style of attire. The tweeds, the browns, the greens, the yellows, the colors of the country when he went out to a country house. Yes. And so you would expect a city gentleman certainly not to be wearing tan boots or brown boots, but black, as is appropriate, or black covered with gray spats, as you say. And here we have tan appearing. So maybe it was Sir Henry's transatlantic crossing outfit. Maybe it was his preparation for transitioning from city to country. But it does seem a rather different and odd selection for the time, certainly to be called out that way.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly what you say is certainly true about tweeds and different attire for the country, and I love that. By the way, I love that they did that so well in things like Downton Abbey, where the costuming was the color choices, the tweed choices were very much of Yorkshire. Which was great, and the cut of the gent suits and so on. But still, it's a mystery. But anyway, the tan boots are important because they provide eventually an important clue. It's something that Holmes notes, and the issue there, of course, and for our listeners who have not read The Hound of the Baskervilles, that there's a theft of the boots. And it turns out, obviously, that because they're new boots, they're not particularly useful to the thief. But that's it's just one example of footwear being really useful. And I'm sure we will be discussing many more of them in just a moment.
Hey, here's a quick question. Did you get a copy of the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual for 2020? Titled The Unique Hamlet, it was edited by Richard Sveum, and it concerned Vincent Starrett's classic pastiche. Many people are asking about this, and the reviews are spectacular. The only thing is, you can't get a copy. Why? Well, the only way you can get a copy of the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual every year is if you have an annual subscription. It's now 2021. Isn't it time that you took out a subscription to the Baker Street Journal? Not only will you get the 4 issues that arrive in the spring, summer, autumn, and winter, but you'll get that 5th Christmas annual issue as well. It's the only way to get that particular issue with one single topic, edited by some of the best Sherlockians in the world. Don't miss your opportunity to get a copy of the 2021 Christmas Annual from the Baker Street Journal at bakerstreetirregulars.com today. We're back talking about footwear in the Canon, and we talked about probably the most famous pair of boots in the Canon, the most famous footwear of Sir Henry. Interestingly, just by way of happenstance, if you become a member of the Bootmakers of Toronto, I believe, and I'm not a member, but I believe the leader of the Bootmakers is called Myers, and that was the name stamped on the boots that Sir Henry had, Myers Toronto, and the medal that goes along with that is a silver shoehorn, from what I've seen.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So speaking of boots, there's an instance in The Empty House when Holmes is describing to Watson how he made his escape. And he said, I stood up and examined the rocky wall behind me. In your picturesque account of the matter, which I read with great interest some months later, you assert that the wall was sheer. Well, this was not literally true. A few small footholds presented themselves, and there was some indication of a ledge. The cliff is so high that to climb it was an obvious impossibility, and it was equally impossible to make my way along the wet path without leaving some tracks. I might, it's true, have reversed my boots, as I've done on similar occasions, but the sight of 3 sets of tracks in one direction would certainly have suggested a deception.
Now, that is remarkable. It's one of my favorite passages in the Canon, and it's remarkable, I think, for 2 reasons. One is it's the only significantly recorded and documented instance of Conan Doyle ever reading something that had been written before and adjusting his narrative because of an inconsistency. The only one.
Yeah. Well, he had to in this case.
But also, it's clearly it's some, things were to hand, and so he could go back and take a look at Final Problem and just reacquaint himself, and said to himself, well, I must say something about that. But luckily, Yeah, luckily his narrator is so frequently flawed that it was easy to. Well, you weren't. But
Well,
not literally.
I'm having trouble imagining Holmes reversing his boots and walking in them. I
Well,
mean, they obviously they don't fit on the foot correctly. He'd have to secure them on in some way.
but you
And
see, this is an important diagnostic moment about Holmes. Clearly, he had contortionist um, characteristics in his ankles and bone structure, such that he could clearly reverse. Like an owl, probably he could.
double jointed in the knee or something like that, or the ankle.
Yeah, or he frequently traveled with straps that allowed him to compress his boots, put them on backwards, and strap them to his feet, which I'm sure he did, while he was in London or at restaurants, or at parties, just to entertain people.
Well, if he was really thinking ahead, he would have brought the cow shoes from the Priory School.
Oh, that's a great one.
Strap those on, right? And then Watson shows up and says, "Why are there cows coming down the track at the Reichenbach Falls?"
Well, that is a great one. In fact, we should just talk about that. That's in the Priory School, where we're talking about horseshoes rather than human shoes. And these are really very remarkable. So Holmes is in Holderness Hall and he reads, "These shoes were dug up in the moat of Holderness Hall, and they are for the use of horses, but they are shaped below with a cloven foot of iron, so as to throw pursuers off the track. They are supposed to have belonged to some of the marauding barons of Holderness in the Middle Ages." Now, I'm prepared to give the benefit of the doubt to Conan Doyle, who was authoritative on life in the Middle Ages through his books, The White Company and others. But I can't imagine a baron in the Middle Ages saying, chaps, before we go out on our romp, why don't we nip down to the stables and just change all the horses' shoes?
Well, that's because you're not a natural marauder, Bert. I mean, when's the last time you went out marauding?
Well, when I was not as long ago as you might think. I mean, every so often on your odd Shrove Tuesday or your particular solstice, I get sort of overwhelmed by the misty urge to go marauding. And
okay, all right, natural urges, I get it. Hey, look, we're all influenced by different things.
Yeah.
Well, another set of footwear that Holmes drew conclusions from was in A Scandal in Bohemia on Watson's Own Footwear. Holmes arrived Watson arrived at Baker Street, and Holmes looked at his feet and said, "My eyes tell me that on the inside of your left shoe, just where the firelight strikes it, the leather is scored by almost 6 parallel cuts. Obviously, that's been caused by someone who very carelessly scraped round the edges of the sole in order to remove crusted mud from it. Hence, you see my double deduction that you have been out in the vile weather and that you've had a particularly malignant boot-slitting specimen of the London slavey."
Well, this is an area where, Watson has exercised some editorial discretion here, because I'm sure what Holmes went on to say was, the remarkable thing here, Watson, is that if anyone was scraping a knife around the sole of a shoe to remove mud, I can understand a small nick, but 6 scrapes in the leather of the boot. This indicates to me that you have some history with this particular gentleman and that you are a poor tipper.
Or that Watson attempted to do it himself and was blind drunk at the time, like his brother, and trying to stick the key in that pocket watch.
Watson, you so frequently attempt to do this. May I remind you that it's much easier if you remove the boot from your foot before you.
And then in the Naval Treaty, again.
Oh, that's a good one.
Small, really a trifle, as we say here. they visit Lord Holdhurst, the cabinet minister, and the future premier of England. And after they leave, Holmes said, "He's a fine fellow, but he has a struggle to keep up his position. He's far from rich and has many calls. You noticed, of course, that his boots had been resold." This observation, Chris Redman writes, doesn't have anything to do with the mystery of the Foreign Office, but it does show that that Lord Holdhurst himself is either very pecuniary or simply has other concerns. And look, it's not uncommon to resole very good shoes. If you buy a pair of shoes from a high-end shoemaker like Church's or Green's, Edward Green, these are shoes that you want to keep around for quite a while, and you spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on them in current funds. But soles do wear out. That's something that happens. And in this age, when we have disposable shoes, we're very accustomed to simply getting new shoes. But certainly back then, and certainly with higher-end shoemakers, you'll want to have them resold. So it showed that Lord Holdhurst was someone who was certainly concerned about the bottom line.
The bottom of his boots. Yeah, it does. But, that's always mystified me from another thing. I'm clearly easily mystified. A couple of things there. One is that how is it exactly that Holmes had enough visibility on the bottoms of this fellow's boots, of Lord Holdhurst's boots, to note that it had been resold?
You didn't know? When they walked in, he was blind drunk and he was passed out on the floor. He was so distraught over the naval treaty.
Oh, well, that's probably true, because, the key giveaway there is how the sole is replaced and reattached to the bottom of the boot. But in any case, that's sort of one thing. That's always bothered me a bit. Second is difficulty in maintaining his position. I mean, if he really had difficulty in maintaining his position, surely there would be other items of his dress and carriage and his personal characteristic other than just resoling boots. And the third thing is that, someone like Lord Holdhurst would have his boots, I think, custom made. And if in fact, your boots are made for you from a shoemaker, the logical thing to do would be, if it needed a new sole, would be just to bring it back to John Lobb, or who, I wonder if John Lobb was in business back in those days, probably in Britain, a great maker of custom shoes. And they would simply essentially remanufacture the bottom of the boot with a new sole and cheerfully send it back to you.
Which is highly likely that that's what happened. And it makes me wonder if Lord Holdhurst simply didn't take care of the uppers on his boots as well as he did the soles. That could be indicative of another personality trait as well.
Yeah, interesting. Or that he got up in something of a fog that morning and put on someone else's boots.
It's been known to happen. His wife's boots. Who knows?
Or it wasn't Lord Holdhurst. It wasn't Lord Holdhurst at all.
It was just his boots that showed up.
Yeah, no.
Never know.
That the fellow that they met. Now there's an interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
It was Lord Holdhurst's boots, but it was not Lord Holdhurst. Interesting.
Well, yeah. Or not Lord Holdhurst's boots, and someone impersonating Lord Holdhurst who didn't have.
Well, we would be remiss if we did not finish this episode without mentioning slippers. We've and I'm not even going to go into tennis shoes because we've covered tennis in another episode. But slippers, there are two instances I can think of slippers. One is when Holmes and Watson go back to Baker Street with James Ryder in the Blue Carbuncle, and Holmes gets all comfortable in front of the fire, puts his slippers on.
Right.
The other is in the Stockbroker's Clerk when Holmes arrives unannounced at Watson's residence, and Watson invites him in, and he said, you've got a summer cold, but you're doing better now. And Watson goes, wait, how do you know that? Holmes says, well, I deduced it from your slippers. I glanced down at the new patent leathers which I was wearing. How on earth, I began, but Holmes answered my questions before it was asked. Your slippers are new, he said. You could not have gotten them more than a few weeks. You could have not had them for more than a few weeks. The soles which you are at this moment presenting to me are slightly scorched. For a moment, I thought they might have got wet and been burned in the drying, but near the instep, there's a small circular wafer of paper with the shopman's hieroglyphics on it. Damp would, of course, remove this. You had then been sitting with your feet outstretched to the fire, which a man would hardly do, even in so wet a June as this, if he were in his full health.
Well, I'm sure that at that moment, what Watson really said to Holmes was, you know, Holmes, you really should get a life.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Valet out for the evening.
They always are.
Elderly housekeeper sleeps atop of the house, heard nothing.
They never do.